Welcome to the Gerontological Society of America's Momentum discussion, where we explore groundbreaking topics in the field of aging.
Welcome to this GSA Momentum Discussion podcast episode titled Reflections of My Weight Journey with Joe Sapone. GSA thanks Novo Nordisk for their support of today's podcast episode. My name is Jen Pettis, and I'm the Director of Strategic Alliances at the Gerontological Society of America, or GSA, and I'm pleased to serve as the host for today's Momentum discussion. I am delighted to be joined today by Joseph, or Joe Sapone. Joe currently resides in Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, with his wife, Carolyn, and their golden retriever, Ella. After a 35-year career in the chemical industry, he currently is doing consulting work, including sales training and coaching. In his spare time, he enjoys hiking, golfing, kayaking, and seeing live music in Manhattan, as well as local Monmouth County venues. Joe has graciously accepted my invitation to share a bit about his weight journey with our listeners. GSA appreciates the Obesity Action Coalition, or OAC, connecting us with Joe. OAC is a more than 85,000 member strong nonprofit organization dedicated to serving the needs of every individual affected by obesity. And Joe is one of those members. Welcome, Joe. I'm so glad you could join me.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation. This is something near and dear to my heart.
Thank you, Joe. Would you start by sharing a little bit about when your journey with obesity began? How old were you and what else was happening in your life at the time? And how did their weight impact your life at that time?
My body size started increasing soon after the birth of my twins. I was in my late 30s and I swapped a lunchtime workout for naps. I was quite fatigued, as you can imagine. It was so challenging in our house that the golden retriever we had at the time left the bedroom after a week and a half to go sleep elsewhere. So I started gaining weight and I wasn't really so much aware of it. At the time, I was fairly fit, in the low 200s, maybe 215. I'm 6 foot, so a little overweight. And then over time, I just started growing and maxing out in my mid 50s, early to mid 50s at 337 pounds. And I had tried several things over time and had lost weight 25 or 30 pounds or more, and subsequently gained it back and usually gained a few pounds more. I'm somebody that knows a lot about nutrition. People tell me I'm a good cook, a gourmet cook, and I had grown up and was a weightlifter and at the gym religiously 4 times a week. A lot of that changed again upon the birth of my twins. So, I had started and stopped and failed and saw a couple of specialists, but they weren't really obesity type people. And then I was traveling, and my background is in chemistry, and I have an MBA as well. And so I've been reading a feature section of the New York Times called the Science Times since I'm in my early 20s. And I read this article, and Dr. Saunders' boss at the time, this guy, Dr. Louis Arani, who really started his obesity research in the mid 1980s. I read an article and it says the title of it was something like "Weight Loss Programs, One Size Fits All, Not a Chance." And I started reading the article and I said to myself, wow, he's describing my life. He's describing my story, how I've started and stopped, how I've failed, and also that how it's so grossly misunderstood, not only by the general population, but by the medical professionals that are not necessarily obesity trained. So that was sometime in December of 2016. And I reached out early the next year and scheduled an appointment to go see Dr. Saunders, who was at the time at Weill Cornell Medical Center. And I don't know how much detail but I walked in, I had a Dartmouth sweatshirt on. My daughter attended Dartmouth. She had a jacket. She had the exact same jacket. And so the bond was immediate. And I won't go into that whole story, but I could tell almost immediately she was different. And from that point on, you project forward 8 years, I'd lost over 120 pounds and I've more or less kept it off. I'll say that the weight loss journey for me, I think, and you'll find this is fairly consistent for most of the people that go through this. You lose some, you plateau, you gain some back. And if you're on a good program, you lose some more, you plateau, you gain some back, and hopefully over time, you continue to lose weight. At this point, I still have about another 25 pounds to go. And so it's still part of my journey. It gets slower over time. The ability to lose weight, it's still there, but for whatever reason, your body adapts, and that's a whole nother technical science conversation.
So it sounds that newspaper article was that aha moment. I'm not the only one going through this. And this is my story. And maybe it's not so much that I'm not doing the right things here. Maybe I'm not having the help I need, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Tell me about, though, as you have the birth of your twins are growing, and how did obesity impact your overall health and wellness during that time? And then as you aged, as you continued to get older and carrying the extra pounds. And so tell me about that.
So I had gone from somebody who was very fit, stretch marks from being so built, to somebody that had put on weight, to the point where for me, even to jog, my heart rate would go up out of range, which became dangerous.
Sure.
I developed high blood pressure. My cholesterol went up. I had developed fatty liver, which is a very worrisome condition to have. And, I'll say that, so that in and of itself is substantial. And then there's these things you feel about how you feel as a person being overweight, and how you're shamed, and how people think it's funny, and it's something it's okay to mock that because for whatever reason. So yeah, it had an impact, but probably because of my own personal nature. I'm very competitive. I tend not to let those things really get in my way as much as probably a lot of the other people.
Sure.
So certainly it had an impact, but it wasn't like it shut me down, right? It wasn't one of those things. I also had to continually buy new clothes, which that's not inexpensive.
Sure. You mentioned a little bit about stigma and bias that people have. We know that individuals with obesity and overweight face that stigma, and it really further complicates their lives in many cases. And for older adults in particular, they may have faced these for years, if not decades, where they face bias in their personal and professional life, again, due to their body size, but also in healthcare. And I wondered if you could share some reflections on maybe how you experienced that personally, professionally, or in healthcare settings.
So it's pervasive. And I'll say professionally, it's like one of those things. There's a bias, but you're never going to hear it, right? For the
Sure.
most part. Personally, yeah, again, people think it's funny. They think you're lazy. They think you're undisciplined. They'll make comments, make faces. They'll blow up their cheeks, that sort of thing. And then in the healthcare system, I had one doctor in particular who she just looked down her nose and she said, you have to lose weight. You're going to die. And she would actually almost chastise me. And I had left that doctor, frankly, and moved on. And rather than being supportive or helpful, that actually made this situation much worse. And that is something that you talk about an aha moment, a second aha moment, when I started with Dr. Saunders. I lost 40 pounds, 42 pounds. And that was probably over, I'll say 8 to 9 months, something like that. And then she informed me that she was going out on maternity leave. And between the time she went out on maternity leave, which was probably 3 months or so before she came back, I'd lost 42 pounds, but I had gained 12 pounds back while she was away. And when she came back, I had a wisecrack. I said, I gained an empathetic 12 pounds back because you were gaining weight, so I would. So she laughed. She's got a really good sense of humor in addition to being a great doctor. And she said, okay, so we sit down to have our conversation, and we have that little conversation. She says, okay, so really no big deal. You gained 12 pounds back, and we're just going to change up your meds. And I was floored. I was like, wow, this is the real thing. Like, she understands it. And so that was really like what I call like a watershed moment in the relationship that I had with her, because I could see that her deeds met her words, which
Yeah.
is a highly unusual thing, I think, these days.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
You mentioned before several other chronic conditions like high blood pressure and things. And I'm just curious, did the doctors ever offer to support you in treating your weight as part of a chronic condition in order to manage those other? I think of folks who get blood pressure pills, but that root cause is probably the extra weight that they're carrying, and that if we treated that, we might have not needed blood pressure medicine. I'm just curious your reflections on that.
No, I really, absolutely not. I took that upon myself, was going to see a therapist who specialized in eating disorders, quote unquote. And so I took it upon myself. And on the one hand, that was helpful. And certainly the psychological part of it is important. It really wasn't effective, but obviously the treatment with Dr. Saunders was. And so I actually went one step further, and I'm a very analytical person, and I would ask Dr. Saunders, because she would tell me what I had to do. And I would ask her if I could see the medical journal articles so that I could understand the why behind the what.
Sure.
And so by reading that, that was transformative for me, because I feel in retrospect, if you read it and you understand why and you still choose to do something else, then that's a whole different story. And then the other thing that was different was not only was I getting treated, I was getting a very comprehensive treatment from somebody who was trained in obesity as a specialty, with one of the original researchers on obesity, Dr. Louis Arani. And so it was a very comprehensive approach in terms of caloric reduction, in terms of logging my food, in terms of watching my macronutrients, in terms of getting consistent blood work done, in terms of even managing your gut biome and how that. So it was really multifaceted. And listen, and in addition to exercise and weight training, which I hadn't done in years, since my 20s. So it's 30 years later, and now I'm doing cardiovascular to 150 minutes a week. I had to work up to that, and doing weight training, and it was working. And
Sure.
it was like, wow, like this is, and I have to tell you, it was earth-shattering to me how effective it was. But for me, at least in my mind, the key thing was having this multifaceted approach that covered all the different aspects of it, including the psychological parts.
So comprehensive approach is so important
Yes,
to
from a
get that.
specialist.
Yeah, get that. Somebody who's trained in obesity management, and you mentioned you had medications, but at the same time you were doing that weight-bearing exercise, having the cardiovascular, the exercise as well, along with diet and keeping track of the nutrients and things like that. Not just calorie reduction, but really looking at what are you eating, not just reducing calories.
Which is what everybody thinks it is. They think it's calories in, calories out. And the truth is it's not. And that was part of what I also came to learn, is that more than 60% of weight issues had a genetic initiation, which that was completely news to me. So when she said, it's not your fault, that's part of what this Dr. Saunders was talking about. And that, when it's a bit more well-known now, but then 7 years ago, nobody had heard anything like that. They just thought we were lazy.
It's not just, not just eat less, move more. There's other stuff going on there for sure. So you noted when we conversed earlier, but also during our discussion here about medications as a component of your weight loss plan. The media has continuous streams of stories about these medications. From your personal experience, what information has been helpful for you as someone living with obesity, and what has been misleading? What would you caution others about as well, I would add to that?
It's a great question, because I was on Good Morning America, and my main concern before I got on that call, because they called me in the morning, wanted to interview me later that day. I was already in New York with my friends. Let's just say we're whooping it up and celebrating and having fun. And I had to pivot and go into prepare for interview mode. And so I found most of what I've heard in media to be unhelpful and misleading, and a lot of mistruths. And then you also hear that secondhand from people who have heard about certain limited aspects of weight loss medications. That was very unhelpful. And frankly, I found that my knowledge level was much higher than what they were talking about. Frankly, my doctor told me, and she's a clinician, she is not somebody to blow a lot of smoke. She said I probably knew more than 98% of active physicians about weight loss. Now I'm unusual. I read those articles. I'm a little bit of a nerd, although you'd never know, an extroverted nerd. Media, one of the main reasons I prepared so much for the interview was that I wanted to make sure that if they asked me a question that was misleading, that I could spin the conversation to something that was more factual. And one of their main things was, will it affect my appreciation or enjoyment of the holidays? And I said, no. Holidays, yeah, food's part of it, but it's about
Right.
family and other things. So it's interesting. That's the way they came at it. Right.
Right.
And then the points about how they disparage it because it's considered a lifetime medicine. Aren't blood pressure meds like that,
Right.
more or less, unless you improve your circumstances? And then the other thing is that there's 200 conditions associated with obesity. And they talk about the monthly cost, but what they don't talk in the media, but what they don't talk about is what is the cost over somebody's lifetime for those 200 conditions or whatever set of conditions they have relative to what it would cost to maybe treat the obesity. So nobody's really done that math yet, but I think that right now is in progress in so-called meta studies.
So you mentioned cost, and I think that's an important time to mention. Right now, Medicare doesn't provide coverage that allows older adults to access the full continuum of care. They don't allow older individuals, people on Medicare, to access medications for weight loss.
Mhm.
And I shouldn't even say for weight loss, I should say for obesity management, right? These are not cosmetic medications. And
Right.
they also don't allow some intensive behavior therapy and things that really is useful to get that comprehensive approach. So what messages do you have for policymakers about what older adults deserve to treat the chronic condition of obesity?
Yeah, so I have some pretty strong feelings about this, obviously. And the first thing is actually one good part is for diabetics, it is covered for Medicare, but not for obesity per se. So again, I would urge and encourage our so-called leaders to think through that concept of what's the net cost of dealing with the conditions associated with obesity versus dealing with obesity in and of itself. And so trying to give them resources they need to get their situation back to where obesity is less of an issue or not an issue so that they can improve their health outcomes. And that, I think, over time, the math will prove out that sort of thing would make more sense. And in my case, for what it's worth, I'm off the cholesterol meds. My blood pressure meds are in half and may very well likely be going away. My fatty liver is gone. I've probably added 10 or more years to my lifespan. And I'm taking less meds overall than I was way back when. And frankly, I'm exercising and weightlifting, and it's had a huge impact on my life, my mental, my mindset, my energy level.
And I would love for you to comment on your quality of life as well, Joe.
It's remarkable. I live in a great place with a great park system, and I hike with the dogs. And frankly, my wife's thinner than me, more than 100 pounds lighter, and maybe not anymore. But it's dramatically improved my quality of life. For the hiking with the dog, she puffs more going up the hills than I do. And so it's remarkable. And I've had to buy a whole new sets of clothes, which is a kind of a high class problem, but you feel different, you act different, and it's really energized me in an incredible way.
It's wonderful. Joe, I so appreciate you taking your time and your openness and sharing your story. It's been lovely to have this conversation with you. What are some final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
That the technology and the options that are available to people to help people lose weight are dramatically different than they were 5 years ago. And compared to 10 years ago, it's not even close, right? So there's a lot of things that can be done. I would highly encourage people to seek out an obesity specialist There's a lot of misinformation out there with so-called compounded products that can get counterfeit materials. You can get bad advice. You can get incomplete advice. So I'd invest in yourself, and you only get one shot at this, right? So there are lots of options compared to what there used to be, and it will change your life.
That's wonderful. Joe, I can't thank you enough again for joining me. And thanks to everyone who listened to this episode of the GSA Momentum Discussion Podcast. We hope you found it informative and enjoyable. And again, Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Check out GSA Enrich at geron.org/enrich for engaging learning resources, including toolkits, publications, webinars, podcasts, and more.